Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss the use of electronic nicotine delivery systems, aka e-cigs, and their association with various factors that we know to be involved in criminal activity, criminogenic risk factors. To set the groundwork for our discussion today, I want to do four key things. I want to get us all on the same page about what these products are. What are we talking about today? Then I want to talk a little bit about some of the problems that we have with data and how gaps in that data and inconsistencies between different surveys can cause problems in making inferences about broader use outside of our survey samples, which would include populations like the criminal justice system involved population where we don't really have survey data. And I want to keep both of those things in mind as we go forward, right? Because BHWP is an evidence-based organization. And personally, I try to keep a scientifically objective perspective in mind when I do presentations like this. But on this particular topic, what I will say about these data challenges is that they're a particular impediment to talking about the criminal justice system. It's nearly impossible to talk about vaping in the criminal justice population because we have very little data on vaping, and we have very little data on nicotine use and its effects inside the criminal justice system, and therefore almost no data where those two things intersect. More importantly, and more tragically, and personally more angering, is that we're unlikely to ever get really good data here. And so while sometimes it's prudent to simply wait for researchers to study areas that we have an interest in, this is just an area where historically a lot of researchers aren't really interested in going, or when they are interested in looking into this area, they're actively prevented from doing so. So I've done what I can to find the data points that I think get us closest to understanding vaping and criminal justice. And that means that I have to make choices about which data points I think are likely to be informative. And while I don't want to engage in unscientific speculation, if I'm going to tell you why I think a particular data point is interesting, it likely involves some inference or speculation on my part. So I encourage you to take the data that I'm sharing at face value and not to infer too much from them. To the extent that it seems I'm inviting you to speculate with me, please keep in mind that these are my speculations. These are predictions about the future that may change based off of current data that maybe I didn't find, or based on future data that none of us have yet. And of course, keep in mind that speculations are like opinions and they're mine. They're not necessarily shared by BHWP, the University of Colorado, or any entity within the state of Arizona, including the Department of Health Services. So as we begin, I want to first set us up with a basic definition of what ENDS are, electronic nicotine delivery systems. And just to be clear, I'm aware that it rarely pays to be pedantic or overly concentrating on word choice when really we're concerned with substantive matters. The problem here is that if you go into the research or if you read news stories about these products, they tend to continue to use the word e-cigs to define all of these. And they're actually all quite different. The default word in this space has been e-cigarettes for a very long time. E-cigarette or electronic cigarette, or shortened all the way down to e-cig. And in common parlance, one or all of these words is used to describe whatever is the most common product in use at the time. So in 2006, when e-cigarettes really first started gaining ground as a cigarette alternative, the term electronic cigarette made a lot of sense. Really, the only products available were thin cylinders of roughly the same length and diameter as conventional cigarettes. These are the ones at the top right. Many of these products were specifically designed to resemble popular brands of cigarettes. Although over time, this aesthetic linkage became less common. They started to look a little bit more space age over time. These terms, the terms here, e-cigarette, electronic cigarette, e-cig, they persisted even as the average ENDS user began to adopt what we now call the vape pen or vape hookah. That's like the ones that look like kind of like that red one there. And vape pen is a suitable enough name for these second generation products, as they do resemble, if you squint hard enough, a modern ballpoint pen. And the term e-cig has continued to persist even as many vape pen users graduated to modifiable devices like that fourth one down, the silver one. Now, each of these devices, these first three generations of products, the original first, second, and third gen products, they all share some common features. And they actually share a lot of those features with these products, which we're not going to be talking about today. And these are some heat not burn products. Plume is a very popular one. IQOS is one, another one, and Eclipse is the third one all the way to the right there. You can see they all look kind of similar. But despite the similarities, they all have really one key difference between them. The first three generations of products all use freebase nicotine, whereas these heat not burn products, the ones pictured here, they vaporize the nicotine out of organic leaf material, normally heavily processed, but it's actually organic product inside. And the fourth generation products, the pods or the pod mods, think Juul, think Swarin Air, they use nicotine salt formulations. They get nicotine out of these nicotine salt solutions. And these differences are important when we think about their likely addictive potential and the overall effect on public health. To properly understand these devices, we need to understand what ties them together and also what distinguishes them from one another. And the most important difference, probably overall, but specifically as it regards one of the motivations behind this module, is the introduction of nicotine salts. And I want to stress that this is a foundational shift in the class of products. And I've tried to deal with this particular issue for this presentation today by confining most of my reference citations to those that have been published within the last 2 years. Because even if we assume a 2 to 3 year publication pipeline from gathering data to publishing on it, we're still capturing some pod use in those populations, unless for some reason they're being specifically excluded. I tried not to use studies where they would be exclusively excluding Juul users. So the real commonalities that make ENDS a family are the use of a battery, primarily a heating element and coil, and then the nicotine solution. I don't want to dwell too much on the battery. You see that I don't actually have battery listed in the definition there to the left. That's because fundamentally, even if this thing were nuclear powered or wind powered, or it was plugged into a wall outlet, it doesn't really change the aerosolization of nicotine that is then being inhaled in the lung. Okay. So now I want to move into some of our data gaps and some of the things that we'll be wrestling with as I say sort of broad terms like ENDS. Now, there's always problems with data, right? So on the one hand, data really only describes the sample from which it was collected. And there are ways then to mathematically adjust data so that we can be somewhat more confident that the sample data also describes the broader population from which that sample came. And the most common way to do that, mathematically that is, I mean, there are selection issues too, but the most common way to do that mathematically is the creation of the confidence interval. The confidence interval basically gives you a range of numbers rather than one single descriptive number, right? And that way we can be more confident that what we're saying is right, even as we lose a little bit of the precision about what we're saying, okay? That's Statistics 101. And I'm not going to proceed from here to a review of all the concepts that we need to know in statistics. I'm just using the confidence interval specifically to point out a really critical difference in our level of confidence when we talk about cigarettes versus the level of confidence that we can have when we talk about ENDS. And that's about the size of the user population. A lot of what we know about cigarettes, and I want to emphasize that we know a lot about cigarettes. A lot of what we know about cigarettes, we know because we have observations about tobacco use going back to the late 15th and early 16th centuries. We have detailed observational studies of the use of combustible tobacco going back to the early 19th century. We have scientifically gathered data on the use of cigarettes in particular going back to the early part of the 20th century, the late part of the 19th century. Due to the addictive nature of nicotine, especially as it is delivered in combustible cigarettes, we have generations of data on the development and progress of tobacco-related diseases in masses of individuals who used cigarettes and cigarettes only for different lengths of time. And finally, due to the great success of public health campaigns to reduce smoking, we have extremely strong evidence of the causal impact of smoking on the incidence of various diseases, most importantly heart disease and lung cancer, but also several others. And I'm just putting this slide up here to indicate that there's a wide consensus that nicotine is the most addictive drug, which is that we sort of commonly run across. I think everybody on the line knows that. But just to emphasize that it is this addictive nature that draws a large swath of the population in and then keeps them there. And then cigarettes are the most addictive form of these nicotine delivery devices that we have. And so once you're sort of in the cigarette world, you sort of stay there. And so we're able to collect data on exclusive cigarette use. And of course, the range of diseases that we have is very broad. And not only is the range of diseases very broad, the magnitude and the number of diseases that we see caused by cigarettes is extremely high. So once again, we have very, very large populations to simply observe. We don't have to run clinical trials to see them. And then I know everybody on the line has seen this graph before because I try to shove it into every presentation that we do, but there is good news, right? Public health has successfully reduced the amount of cigarette use nationwide in the adult population dramatically. It's been reduced by several fold over the course of the last 50 years or so. And that increase that I showed you at the beginning of this section, and then now this decrease on the other side of it, this is also important in determining causality. None of this is true with e-cigs, right? Ends represent a very tiny fraction of overall tobacco use. And tobacco use in general is at its lowest recorded rate since we have systematically been keeping records of it. It is certainly still represents millions of people across the country, approximately 9-ish million people or so, but it's not nearly comparable to the magnitude of individuals who used cigarettes 60 years ago. Not only are far fewer people using ends than have ever used cigarettes in the recorded history of cigarettes, but nearly all of the adults who use ends started with cigarettes first. And we have to remember a couple of things about cigarette-related diseases, because cigarette-caused diseases. Right, to simplify this point, let's just consider heart disease. Not every smoker will develop heart disease, and not everyone who develops heart disease is a smoker. And this introduces a corollary that among smokers who also develop heart disease, there are those who developed heart disease from their tobacco use, and also others that got their heart disease from some other factor, right? So even if a current ends user were to develop a disease, sorry about that. Even if a current ends user were to develop a disease, it would be hard to disentangle whether ends was the reason, or maybe it was the previous cigarette use or their concurrent dual use, or some third, perhaps completely unrelated cause. So again, we just need really large numbers for this. As of 2018, which prior to putting this presentation together was the last time I really looked at this data, nearly 60% of anyone who had ever used ends were currently dual using or had relapsed or progressed to conventional cigarettes. And another 30% had smoked cigarettes prior to using ends. So the pool of individuals who were currently using ends and had only used ends and had exclusively used ends long enough to develop a condition like heart disease or lung cancer was effectively zero. And this is compounded by the fact that such diseases take decades to develop. And as of 2018, e-cigarettes had only been on the market for about 10 years and were being almost used exclusively by young adults, individuals who simply haven't even lived long enough to have developed a condition like heart disease or lung cancer from some exogenous force, some outside force, like a tobacco product. 2022 represents the beginning of a new phase of our ability to understand ends use. Many of you will remember the 2017 surge of electronic nicotine delivery system use after the introduction of Juul in late 2016. This surge and the reason for the concern was concentrated not just among young people, sort of broadly speaking, but seemed to be taking root primarily among high school students, right? Juul represented a new threat. Much of the press at the time was focused on the sleekness of this device, how cool it looked. I have dozens of articles saved on my computer about Juul, and nearly all of them refer to it as the iPhone of smoking or vaping devices. This fascination on its visual appeal distracted observers, including many in public health, from the truly important difference between Juul and the ends that preceded it, and that is its patented nicotine salt formulation. In their patent for the Juul device, Juul Labs showed a pharmacokinetic graph, this one that's showed on the slide here, that in their opinion, this graph justified their patent application, because it proved that their device delivered nicotine to the body far faster and at far higher doses than any electronic nicotine delivery system currently on the market. And in fact, according to Juul Labs, their device delivered nicotine more efficiently than an actual cigarette, although their experimental cigarette was a Pall Mall rather than the standardized test cigarette normally used for such comparisons. And I don't know how that would have impacted what this graph looks like. In their marketing materials and in a later report that they commissioned, Juul says that their product, the Juul product, is as, quote, satisfying as a cigarette. And it's really hard not to hear that word satisfying and not hear the word addictive, since we know that what smokers crave when they crave a cigarette is the nicotine inside of it. Nicotine is what satisfies the dependent tobacco user. In order to obtain the FDA's approval to the market their device, Juul Labs had to prove that their product did not constitute a public health threat. And so in 2018, they had a report commissioned to prove that smokers who switched to Juul did not dual use or relapse to cigarettes. And I don't remember the precise numbers of that report, but that is in fact what they published. And you can find that report online. I'm not here to challenge or support that finding necessarily, but let's assume that it's true for the time being, right? What might that mean for us? So in general, high school ages 14 to 18, right? If an individual was 14, 15, 16, 17, or 18 years old in 2017, between 2017 and 2018, ENDS use surges, right? It surges from about 11% to about 22% past 30 days use, right? So it doubles in that year. So if you're 14 through 18 in that year, what that means is that now in 2022, these folks are 19 to 23. They are squarely within the realm of what we call young adults, okay? Which is a demographic that our national surveys break out to look at in particular, right? 18 to 24. So they're squarely in the middle of that young adult range. So this is the first cohort of people, those that were in high school in 2017 when the Juul surge happened, is the first group of people that for whom we may see the impacts, the benefits or harms of exclusive ENDS use, and also the development of certain associated behaviors. Now, before I go any further, I do want to say explicitly that I think that's a tragedy. I don't think it's a good thing that so many young people are essentially guinea pigs for epidemiologists and the tobacco companies. And I also want to point out that I will not be using the phrase that they volunteered to be guinea pigs or that they chose to be guinea pigs. Choice is a much more complicated concept than we normally give it credit for. The ENDS companies like Juul Labs and the tobacco industry giants that own most of those companies, they manufactured the desire to use their products the same way they've done so for the past 100 years, through identifying weaknesses like poverty, stress, and isolation, and then selling nicotine intoxication as a solution, or by identifying strengths like strong social networks and converting those strengths to their favor by exploiting the power of in-group desirability to addict entire subpopulations together. I don't think that's a good thing, but it is a thing. Which is all to say that a lot of what I'm about to talk about isn't speculation, right? It's my best attempt to look at the data that we have that will form the basis of somebody else's speculation, especially as it pertains to our population of interest, which are those individuals within the criminal justice system. So, and this is a population that I reiterate, we know very little about. Take these two graphs, for example. We at BHWP have been using these graphs for years, and they are old. The data is old. The information in these graphs represent, in my opinion, the very minimum data we should be collecting about the health of inmates. This is final endpoint data. This is what they're dying of. This doesn't describe when these diseases emerged. It doesn't describe the progression of the diseases. It doesn't discuss treatments that were provided or withheld or why or for whom. It's impossible to look at this data and act on it in a meaningful way. And this is information this information that we have here hasn't been updated in years. And I rarely remark on the morality of public health surveillance systems. But again, and in my own personal opinion, a failure to collect this kind of data from marginalized communities represents a very specific form of health injustice. This is data injustice. If we don't count the problem, we can't understand the problem. And if we can't understand the problem, we can't fix the problem. Failing to systematically observe is willful negligence. And the fact is that even if we don't look at the problem, sheriffs, deputies, correctional officers, wardens, nurses, doctors, psychiatrists, correctional health agents, public health agents, parole and probation officers, judges, employers, neighbors, family members, husbands, wives, and children, they're going to deal with this problem anyway. So it is worth taking the time to explore what we do know so that we can make some reasonable guesses of what is happening and how these problems may change in the future so that we can prepare ourselves and the systems that we work for to be proactive where we can be and effectively reactive where we can't be proactive. So what I'm going to do now is move into the lay of the land, right? Our basic prevalence data. And I'd like to give you a sense of how quickly this landscape is changing and also get a general sense of scale, in part to provide some perspective. When we talk about youth and drug use, at least as it concerns, say, nicotine and alcohol and marijuana, and also more serious drugs, there is a quote unquote more serious drugs. There's a tendency to sound the alarm about the use rates and then never stop sounding it, even when things are, relatively speaking, better than they were when the alarm was first sounded. And to be clear, I want the prevalence rate of all drugs prior to the age of 25 to be precisely 0. So anything above 0 is worth our attention and our action. That said, we need to appreciate that there really is a difference between 11% and 22%. And if the alarm we're sending out doesn't reflect those differences, then people will stop hearing our alarm and nothing will get done to drive us back to 0. So our major source of data for nicotine use among individuals younger than 18 is the National Youth Tobacco Survey. This survey is done at the school district level, and then the aggregated results are processed in such a way as to generate a nationally representative sample. The NYTS actually surveys middle schoolers and high schoolers, but I'm only concentrating on the high schoolers statistics because for today's presentation, I'm mostly concerned with determining what is happening or will happen in our adult incarcerated population. So a couple things to note about the graph pictured here. This is the first is that this is a measure of what the NYTS calls current use. And to that survey, current use is defined as at least one puff within the last 30 days. This definition is a good one for predicting future trends, future use trends, as well as for finding correlations with current risk factors like concurrent drug use. However, it is very different than how we define current use for adults. For adults, we normally ask something like, do you currently use tobacco products on all or most days? The NYTS does break down frequency of use into 3 levels, 1 to 5 days per month, 6 to 19 days per month, and 20 to 30 days per month. Now, personally, I would probably think of anything above 16 days as constituting all or most days. That would give us our most obvious correlation with the adult data. But we don't get that level of granularity here. So for purposes of comparing our youth data pictured here to our adult data later on, let's just look at some interesting association with regular ENDS use among high schoolers and with a specific focus on those using more than 19 days per month. ENDS became something you should know before we go further too. ENDS became the #1 tobacco product used by high schoolers in 2014. And that remains the case today. And for that matter, combustible tobacco use has continued to fall in the years since. So ENDS is becoming the representative tobacco use category. And that's going to become important when we're trying to extrapolate some data later. The second thing, or another thing to note, is that the last 4 years of data can't be directly compared to each other or to the first several years of data on this chart. In response to the growing use of ENDS and because of changes due to COVID in 2020, they have continued to refine and change their data collection methods. And this is why the first few bars the last few bars use the pattern fill and not the solid fill that you see on the left-hand side of this chart. But all of these years are supposed to have created representative samples, and so they should be more or less comparable, at least for the general trends should be the same, so comparable for our purposes. The next thing to note is that this category that we want to focus on, this 20 to 30 days per month, for ENDS, for electronic nicotine delivery systems, this is the highest use category, representing 44% of the past 30 days users. Light use is just a few points behind at 40%. So we have a really bimodal distribution here. And that's very different than what we see with cigarettes. Among those who use cigarettes in the last 30 days, most users, 67% of them, only use 1 to 5 days per month. And only 20% use at that higher level, 20 to 30 days per month. So if we're only looking at this highest category, 20 to 30 days of use per month, and we see 44% of ENDS users in that category, and compare that to just the 20% we see in cigarettes, it's tempting to jump to the conclusion that ENDS users are more dependent. But then we'd have to come up with a different rationale for why a nearly identical proportion of ENDS users are in that lightest category. If nothing else, that frequency of use, if it doesn't indicate higher current dependence, it's certainly indicative or a potential early warning sign for more intense future addiction as these individuals graduate to adulthood. Now, I brought up the fact that e-cigs are becoming the representative tobacco product category because one of our data gaps, or at least data I couldn't find when I went looking for it, was the association of ENDS use and very specific socioeconomic determinants of health behavior. And we have those figures even in this survey for tobacco products overall. I'll share some of those in just a second. And I think that's important. And just to give you an example of why, what I went looking for when I decided to put this presentation together. Several years ago, I put together a presentation for the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. And at that time, there was a pronounced disparity in the number of smokers who were committing acts of delinquency or exhibiting behavioral issues and experiencing emotional distress in the smokers compared to the general population. And this is all youth data, right? The population of youth who used vaping products did not have a disproportionate share of those activities or personality traits. But something happens, right? In the intervening several years, the public health campaign against ENDS, and especially for ENDS use among youth, have really ramped up, right? States began flavor bans in 2017 when youth vaping was deemed an epidemic, and then that call that it was an epidemic sort of filtered out through public health campaigns and newspapers and news reports on the TV. Then the legal age to purchase tobacco products was raised to 21. And prior to this law, some high school seniors could purchase tobacco legally and use it. And also they could become conduits, getting tobacco products to younger schoolmates. Then EVALI, right, the vaping related lung injury that disease began to emerge, and that occurred just months prior to the arrival of COVID. And COVID, of course, caused huge shifts in our living, work, and school attendance patterns, which is all to say that several factors, including legal, normative, and supervisory restrictions, may have added the kinds of pressures that raise the bar to use in such a way that adolescents with higher dependence may stay there, whereas those with lower dependence may be pushed out of the vaping population. And adolescents inspired to assert their independence and their identity through risk-seeking behavior may be more attracted to picking up the habit, right? Because now this is perceived as risky and verboten, forbidden, right? So now this looks enticing to a certain type of teenager. And adolescents with less aversion to criminal sanction, some overlap with the group I just described, or its youth equivalent, right? They're all more likely to add or persist in ENDS use, while those who don't have those personality-based incentives may be encouraged to quit with the additional social pressures, which is all to say, 2019, as you can see on this chart, was a peak year. The NYTS reported past 30 days use of about 27%. Now, just think about what we saw with smoking prevalence over the last 50 years. As smoking prevalence has declined, we have found that factors associated with initiation, factors associated with use, and factors associated with relapse have become increasingly concentrated in the pool of smokers that have remained, right? So we should expect, or we could expect, that our lower barrier to vaping prior to 2017, plus the incentive to quit since 2017, might similarly concentrate sort of these sorts of, say, mental health, psychological distress factors in our continued vaping population. And so the question is, do we? Well, when we look at tobacco use overall, I guess, again, this is tobacco use overall, say with psychological distress, we see that high schoolers that are categorized as having severe distress as measured on a PHQ-4, they're twice as likely to use tobacco products than those who have no distress. And similarly with low grades, individuals getting mostly Fs, but this is self-report, are twice as likely to be tobacco users than those receiving mostly As. So again, reiterating, this is tobacco use, but keeping in mind that over the course of these last 5 to 7 years, e-cigarette use is the representative tobacco use structure that we're seeing. So we're not seeing any dilution of these particular associated risk factors. And bearing in mind that both of these, by the way, psychological distress and lower grades, are associated with future criminal system involvement. So before moving on to adult prevalence, I just want to just kind of recall these numbers again. Just look at these numbers one more time. And what we're seeing here is, if we look at prevalence rate from, say, 2016 forward, 2016 to 5 years, 17, 18, 19, 20, 2016 to 2020. I can't math in front of people. You see 11%, right? 11%, 21%, 27%, and 19%. And if you just quickly do the average on that, that's 18% averaged over those 5 years, right? So, and as we said before, about half, a little less than half of those smoke on all or most days. They're smoking 20 to 30 days per month. And that gives us a benchmark low-end expectation of about 9% of young adults currently using ENDS products. Okay, we can just see that in this data. The question is, are we right? Well, we don't have 2021 data. But we do have 2020 data, and it was released earlier this year in March. And in that report, young adults, those are the ones ages 18 to 24, were the highest age demographic using ENDS products, and that prevalence rate is 9.4%. This was almost double the next highest age demographic at 25 to 44. The age is 25 to 44. They're using ENDS products at a rate of about 5.2%. All right, so even though the metric of past 30 days use is broader and likely to catch more casual users, if we focus our attention on just those high schoolers who use regularly, we can get a pretty good sense of what adult use will look like 4 to 5 years later. And I'm pointing that out as a sort of a tool for future speculation, right? We just happen to do a lot more intense scrutiny of high schoolers' drug-related behaviors, criminogenic behaviors, delinquency-related behaviors, psychological and emotional distresses, right? We have few more touches with that audience. And so if you kind of want to understand what 18 to 24 is going to look like 4 to 5 years down the road, we can use our high school figures as one way of doing that. That's why I'm bringing that up. So now I want to move from here to what we see in regard to adult use overall. And now we're really going to start focusing on those associations with social determinants of health that also happen to be related to criminal justice system involvement. So there we go. One quick word of caution. Whoa, hey now. One quick word of caution. By design, and I want to reiterate this, by design, none of our national surveillance instruments are deployed into group living residences, which includes psychiatric facilities, jails, and prisons. So when you see the associations that are coming up, try to keep in mind that these are extremely diluted associations in the sense that we know that in those institutions, mental illness, substance abuse, and tobacco use are all much, much higher than they are in the general population. So let's look at some of these factors that we're concerned with here. In regard to education, of the 12.5% of adult respondents reporting cigarette use in our national survey instruments, there remains a familiar pattern with individuals with a GED reporting the highest use, right? 32% of individuals with a GED currently smoke cigarettes. And then progressing downward as educational attainment goes up, right? So only 3.5% of individuals with a graduate degree smoke cigarettes. While the percentages are lower for ENDS, this pattern still holds largely true. 5.4% of individuals with GEDs report using ENDS, and 1.5% of folks with graduate degrees use ENDS. Now, 1.5% of folks with graduate degrees use ENDS, but interestingly, and I'm sure entirely coincidentally, by the way, 1.4% of individuals with no degree also report using ENDS. Those numbers are basically the same, right? And this is different than with cigarettes, where only 21.5% smoke cigarettes. So we just see a slightly different curve between these two products. And this may be important when we think about income in just a second. It's easy to hypothesize that the low number of graduate degrees that vape has a lot to do with age, right? We know that the majority of ENDS users are 18 to 24 years old, and therefore many of them aren't old enough yet to have gotten a graduate degree. It's less easy to explain the relatively low percent of vapers among those with no degree at all. Now, looking at income, we see a similar anomaly. They're not the same. Cigarettes and cigarette users, cigarette smokers, and vapers are not the same. With cigarettes, we continue to see the familiar pattern that we've seen for decades. Cigarette use simply declines as income increases, and it's just that linear. 22% of individuals who earn $35,000 a year or less report using cigarettes, and that just continues to drop until 10% of those making over 100 grand smoke. With ENDS, we see something entirely different. The lowest percent is among those making 100,000, right? That's what you might expect from what I just said. It's 3.2% of folks making over 100 grand per year use ENDS. And that, like I said, that seems fairly normal. But 3.7% of those making less than 35,000 report vaping. So again, these numbers are basically the same number, right? And from there, as income goes up, so does prevalence. 33.9% of those making $35,000 to $75,000 per year, and then 4.5% for those making between $75,000 and $100,000 per year. So that drop off at 100%, or I'm sorry, that drop off at $100,000 per year is most likely the result of the age cohort effect that we've already noted, right? Older adults are way less likely to vape, and income is a function of age. But that doesn't really explain what's going on in those lower numbers. Since income and education are often correlated for obvious reasons, this is what we may be seeing here is just indicative of the lack of or the failure to denormalize vaping, right? That is, cigarette smoking is associated in the public imagination with poverty, low education, minimum wage, quote unquote, unskilled labor, delinquency, criminality, blah, 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 on and on. And so individuals who do or hope to earn more are just less likely to start smoking and more likely to quit if they do start. But these same incentive structures do not seem to be playing the same effect on vaping or on those who vape. All this data, by the way, for the last couple slides, has been coming from the National Health Interview Survey. So if you're seeing some percentages that don't jibe with numbers that you're using yourself, maybe you're using Burfus or any of the tobacco use supplement to the ACS or something like that. That's where my numbers are coming from. So moving forward into mental health. Of all the respondents of the National Health Interview Survey, about 47% reported feelings of anxiety. So this is our relationship between any mental health condition and past tobacco use, right? So this is from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health from, I want to say 2 years ago, but you can see that this is virtually a one-to-one comparison with broad tobacco use and mental health. This is what we're seeing in our cigarettes versus ends in the National Health Interview Survey. So of all the 47% of those 47% report feelings of anxiety, and 21.4% of them smoke cigarettes, and 7.1 use ends, right? So that's that middle column, right, under anxiety. There's some dual use in this measure, so it's not a perfect comparison. So you kind of have to we're just doing rough calculations here. But cigarettes constitute about 66% of all tobacco use, and e-cigs at the second most popular class of product are about 19.5%. And so what that means is, all things being equal, if ends were just exactly as attractive to people with anxiety as cigarettes seem to be, say from a self-medication or stress relieving perspective, the number we would calculate based off the cigarette numbers is that we should see about 6.3% of individuals reporting anxiety who also use ends. And we see really close to that number, right? 7.1%. I mean, we don't need to go hog wild, go super crazy about inferring a lot from this. We don't want to say that ends are just way more attractive for anxiety relieving purposes over cigarettes or something like that. The numbers are really close. And that is in fact what we see with depression as well. As a matter of fact, much closer with depression. About 53.9% of National Health Interview Survey respondents reported feelings of depression. And of those, 29.6% of them report smoking cigarettes. All things being equal, we would expect to see about 7.9% of ends users, of people reporting feelings of depression using ends. And we see really close to that number, about 8.3%. So when we're talking about behavioral health, I don't want to go too far ahead. I just want to point out why this matters, right? When I looked at this data 5 years ago, ends use did not have a disproportionate share of individuals with anxiety or depression. Now they seem to be converging to the same approximate disproportional use as cigarettes do, as a function of how many people are using each of these products, right? So what we would expect at this point, and this is where I'm engaging in some of that inference, some of that speculation based on current trends, is that as more people use ends, we will start to see the same levels and types of disproportionalities that we've already seen with smoking, okay? So when we're talking about behavioral health, we're not just talking about mental health, we're also talking about substance abuse. So I want to talk about a little bit about vaping and its relationship to other drugs. And this is I'm not going to remind anybody, I'm not sharing studies on the relationship between smoking and the use of other drugs. I think everybody is aware that they're highly correlated, right? Risky behaviors are just generally correlated across the board. And now that we're making vaping more and more risky, we should start to see some associations between vaping and other drug use, other risky behaviors. And that is in fact what we see. I list, 7 or 8 studies on this slide, and we see that vaping is associated with smoking. So some people are going to start with vaping and they're going to become smokers, and then they're going to be exposed to those sets of risk factors that we're already familiar with. We also see that vaping is associated with binge drinking. This is directly, so this is without smoking as a mediator. We see vaping is associated with marijuana use, and not just marijuana use, but also dual use. And then we see that vaping, nicotine, and marijuana together is associated with general delinquency. And you can see these are youth figures. And nicotine vaping is also associated with concurrent use of cocaine, amphetamines, hallucinogens, heroin, ecstasy, and OTC medications. Now, this is not perfect concordance, right? It's not like, oh, well, 60% of kids have lifetime exposure to vaping, and therefore 60% of the kids are also experimenting with LSD and peyote. It's not quite that high, but the associations do track. So as frequency of use and exposure goes up, then so do subsequent drug use down the line, okay? So I don't want to rush to the conclusion that ENDS use leads to or causes other drug use, although we do have evidence that nicotine use can affect the developing brain in a way that makes future addictions more likely. It's really hard to make a definitive case that nicotine alone leads to these results, partially because these results are clearly not inevitable. Most adolescents who experiment with nicotine, and even among those who become regular users, don't go on to experiment, let alone become dependent on other drugs. Alcohol perhaps being one of the major exceptions here, since criminal sanction on other drugs seems to be broadly protective. And of course, one of the reasons it's so hard to disentangle is because the preconditions that make access and exposure to nicotine more likely and its use more attractive are also independently correlated with access to, exposure to, and the normalization of other drugs. That is, to say that a slightly different way, the same psychological, social, familial, financial factors that make using and becoming dependent on nicotine more likely are also likely to contribute to the experimentation and potential dependence to other drugs. So, for example, a recent study, the one cited here in Travia et al., found that low self-control is associated with ENDS use in adolescence, right? That seems really straightforward. And from here, it's not hard to imagine a case where low self-control precedes all drug use and independently makes use of any drug more likely, and simply just being lower barrier to entry, right? In terms of it's really available, there's a lot of peer pressure, it's super cheap. Until recently, there wasn't a lot of criminal sanction involved with it or delinquency related sanction. So it's also not hard to imagine a case where low self-control can independently lead to criminal justice system involvement, regardless of if vaping or other drugs are involved. Although it's also not hard to see how self-control combined with vaping may act additively or even multiplicatively to make future criminal justice system involvement more likely than the presence of low self-control or vaping in isolation, right? Take another study, for example, Jackson et al. 2021. In that study, they looked at police stops at youth at age 14 and their subsequent use of drugs. And in that study, they found that youth who had an encounter with law enforcement at age 14 were more than twice as likely to be vaping by age 17. And the authors here suggest that having been stopped by police by age 14 causes youth to vape. And I'm putting causes kind of in italics here as I say it out loud. The researchers did control for the presence of substances, other substance use at the time of the stop, but it remains the case that misbehaving is extremely cheap, right? To misbehave, it costs no money. Misbehaving is extremely cheap, financially speaking, cheaper even than vaping or smoking, and keeping in mind that vaping is a form of misbehavior in young people. So it's hard to separate the inclination to vape from the inclination to engage in other acts of delinquency. And this, by the way, is a limitation on determining causality that the authors themselves freely discuss. And of course, we have a growing body of evidence from the cognitive sciences, specifically the branch of that science that's developing the theory that's sort of long-windedly called competing neurobehavioral decision systems, right? So we call thinking fast and slow, right? Thinking fast and slow shows us or hypothesizes that stress and insufficient cognitive resources contribute to executive dysfunction. And this executive dysfunction then can lead to poor health behaviors like vaping. And it can also, that's what Bickle et al. Here says, and I'll go ahead and add to that and say that reduced executive dysfunction is also related to other things like underperformance in schools, rash and risky decision-making, behavioral issues, and of course, further down the road, criminal delinquency. Okay, so for our purposes, it doesn't really matter the magnitude or the direction of causality here, right? The association is all that really matters. It remains the case that the association of vaping with criminogenic behavior, causal or not, will still ultimately lead to disproportionate shares of incarcerated individuals being dependent on nicotine, with electronic systems being a popular means of delivery. So I want to look, and this is something that we kind of already know. This is a slide that we have shared before, right? So before going on into the next section, I want to look at one more precursor to nicotine, or to vaping, right? Or to what we know as an association with smoking, and it's ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences make use, misuse, abuse, dependence, whatever word we want to use here, dependence of substances more likely. And this is right. We know this is true of smoking. And these are facts that we've shared with this community of practice before. We also know that ACEs are associated causally with future involvement with the criminal justice system. When the original ACEs studies were done, ends didn't exist. Now that they've existed for a decade and a half, do we have enough data to conclude that ACEs lead to vaping? Well, conclude is probably too strong, but we are starting to see what we would expect to see. It's starting to come out in the studies, right? So this one here is out of Florida, Boccia et al., and they concluded that indeed ACEs are cumulatively associated with vaping, which is to say that more ACEs means a higher risk that the person being studied here is going to engage in vaping. So they're cumulatively involved in vaping, and not just vaping, but also in marijuana use, and not just vaping and marijuana use, but vaping and marijuana use together. And just 3 or 4 slides ago, I mentioned that we have other studies saying that once we see dual use, we start to see positive associations with, or direct associations with delinquency. So as I already mentioned, no one should be surprised by this, right? I don't think anyone is. To the extent that ACEs has been shown to cause people to experiment with and become dependent on cigarettes, which is what we said before, we have to understand that smoking is a nicotine-seeking behavior, right? We should always have known that ACEs doesn't lead to smoking, it leads to nicotine-seeking behavior, and ends, especially the post-2016 pod-based products, are very effective at delivering nicotine. Similarly, smoking marijuana leaves isn't about the smoking part, it's about the THC, right? Or the CBD or other cannabinoids. All right, this is THC seeking behavior. And vaping is not only very good at delivering these chemicals to the brain, but it's even better at delivering them consistently and at the desired ratios. I don't expect any future study in this particular domain to conclude anything other than what Boccia et al. Found, at least in the direction of the relationship, although obviously magnitudes may vary in different populations. So once again, we're really left concluding that given the established relationship between ACEs and incarceration and relationship between ACEs and vaping, that our jails and prisons will probably already have, a disproportionate share of vapors compared to the general population. Now, this is all leading up to what I think is maybe one of the most important topics of the day, and that's dual use of vape with other drugs of abuse. So the acronym here is DOTNs, drugs other than nicotine. So nicotine with drugs other than nicotine. And here I'm talking, of course, about general dual use, but I'm also talking about factors that are specific to vaping, okay? That may influence the way these drugs are used, or the expectations that we should set about people who are dual using, or not the people themselves, but the impact on them. So firstly, throughout this presentation, I have been casually referring to the use of ends as vaping, and I've been calling these folks vapers. And this is shorthand for uses ends, right? But it's also an incorrect shorthand. What is inhaled is not, scientifically speaking, a vapor, but it is an aerosol. That is to say that they're small, but nonetheless measurable, solid particulate matter in the actual aerosol, right? That's what makes it an aerosol, is this solid particulate matter. And I'm bringing this up because it's hard for individuals, especially younger individuals, to intuit this. E-juice is a liquid with no visible solids in it. So, how is it an aerosol? How is it not vapor, harmless water vapor? It's much easier to make the link to solid particulate matter with products like Plume and IQOS, right? I've already mentioned these. And these products, as I already mentioned, vaporize nicotine from the, not from a liquid solution, but from the leaf itself or some processed version of the leaf itself. And I'm bringing this up because these products, because they have hit the US market after Juul and the other pods, are often perceived as 5th generation products. But in fact, the product called Plume, that's the blue and black one here on the left, it's been popular in Japan for years, and it's already moved into mostly European markets. In fact, that product, Plume, was sold to Japan Tobacco Inc. by a company called Plume. And after selling Plume to JTI and retaining the rights to a similar device, that company changed its name to Pax Labs in 2015. Pax Labs is the company that made the Juul device. And when they did that, they spun off Juul Labs. So all of these products, and we're just now introducing, we're really late in the game here, this concept of dual use, but these products were developed with dual use in mind by companies familiar with multiple drug use patterns, okay? And if you're trying to explain how vaporizing, quote unquote, vaporizing can lead to solid particulate matter, it might make sense to appeal to this idea of vaporizing directly from organic material. So we have known ever since commercially available nicotine vaping devices have been available that individuals have been experimenting with using those devices to deliver other drugs to their systems. There are countless websites and videos that you can watch to show you how to modify either the e-liquid or the actual devices themselves in a way to, I'm going to say theoretically here, deliver those drugs in a bioavailable way and at an adequate dose to achieve whatever desired effect is desired, right? Whatever desired effect is being sought here. And these modifications might include changing the battery size or the heating coil size or shape. We also know that marijuana can be used in these devices with little or no modification. As researchers were collecting vaping devices from the EVALI patients in the summer and fall of 2019, what they collected were primarily unaltered pod-based devices using pods that had been filled or refilled with e-juice containing THC and also the adulterant vitamin E acetate, which I'll return to on the next slide. Similarly, unmodified devices had been used to deliver synthetic cathinones, aka bath salts. The effect of vaporizing, that is creating a condensation aerosol and inhaling it, the effect of that is that in many cases, this changes the speed of onset and how long the drug's effects remain. In both cases, speeding it up. Quicker action often responds to more rapid metabolization and more rapid resensitization, encouraging users to use smaller amounts more frequently. Both of those things combined are a recipe for more and stronger dependence. And that's what we see with nicotine. That's one of the reasons why nicotine is as addictive as it is. The study I'm citing here in the third bullet point notes that this was already a well-known feature of aerosolization. This was already well-known in 2016 for cocaine and methamphetamine. And this study was adding bath salts to that list. Now, this may be related to more recent studies like the last two on this slide that look at combining drugs inside of e-liquids and find that doing so changes the size of the droplets that are inhaled, which then increases the size of the droplets getting into the body, therefore delivering different amounts of the drug. If the droplets get bigger, you get more of the drug at once. Okay, so these alterations in habit and drug delivery present known and theoretical risks. First of all, tampering with these devices always exposes the user to technological and or mechanical failure, keeping in mind that these devices weren't built to last anyway, and they have been known to malfunction up to and including exploding. But a quick visit to an ends modification video like on YouTube will alert you to all sorts of potential problems, raising the output of the battery or changing the heating coil size or shape so that it can get hotter, can move the heating of the product up past the point of boiling or vaporization into the realm where it combusts, exposing users to known carcinogens like formaldehyde and acetaldehyde. More relevant risks for today's presentations are the next three. When users procure illegal substances, they are engaging with unregulated criminal markets. And we know that even in the modestly regulated tobacco products market, nicotine has tended to be under-labeled in these e-juices. Researchers have found that e-juice vials claiming to contain 0% nicotine, in fact, have nicotine. And more recent research has found that vials listed as containing THC, at least in the UK, have tended to over-report that content. Under or over-reporting psychoactive drug content can lead to unexpected and sudden cravings or overdose. Also, novice or uninformed users may not appreciate the alterations to their drug experience caused by the switch of these modalities. This too can lead to overdose on the one hand, or if the user escapes that fate, then to an increased tolerance and higher intensity dependence. And I don't want to underplay the importance of drug users getting ripped off, getting less drugs than they anticipated, or being put into mild bodily discomfort. But for the purposes of today, I would just like to highlight that unexpected cravings, intense cravings, higher dependence, all of those things and all through various mechanisms are associated and are related to criminogenic behaviors, including threatening behavior, assault, property crime, and others. Now, as my time is rapidly vanishing, there's one more thing I want to bring up, and that's this. While the threat of ends is growing, especially among the age group most likely to become incarcerated, right, our young adults, protected spaces for recovery in jails are starting to vanish. Wardens are thinking that the reduced risk from secondhand smoke exposure offered by e-cigs provides them an opportunity to relax their clean indoor policies and allow e-cigs. And not just allow them, but to make a profit off of them. And I don't have time to truly explore the problems with this, but I will quickly say this. Wardens and jail operators are saying that tobacco products are major commodities on the black markets within the jails themselves. And I know that's true. Right? But I also know that there are other non-contraband items like salted fish and ramen that are traded on black markets in prisons, right? And I also, and more importantly, I know that other contraband like heroin and meth end up in the jails and prisons. And wardens are now gleefully handing inmates the very devices that they can use to take those drugs. And so I'm at 4 minutes. And I just want to very briefly recap. This is the summary. I'm not going to read all of it. If I want you to take away one big thing from this presentation, it's the, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 8th bullet point in this recap. And that is, we have, I think, held out hope for a really long time that for a variety of different reasons, e-cig populations were going to look very different than tobacco using populations. And they may still, in fact, turn out to be quite different. But what we're seeing now is a convergence of precursors leading to vaping in the same way that precursors led to smoking, which is already making sure that those populations look the same going into the vaping habit. And we're starting to see certain other kinds of pressures making sure that the same sorts of disproportionalities that we observe in smoking populations are getting locked into the vaping population. And so I don't anticipate anything changing that outside of some pretty massive regulatory changes that may or may not happen. But the trend right now is that those bottom 2 bullet points, that jails right now are being incentivized to not act in the best interest of their inmates in that way, and are instead looking to potentially raise the prevalence rates of ends by forbidding smoking and allowing ends, if that makes sense. So the prison population, the jail population, may be the first population that we have access to where we start to see what the real effect, the public health impact of ends may be. And that is going to be my time. So we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any, and you can just unmute yourself or I don't know, chat, Q&A.